The day John G. Lake was in two places at once. What if I told you there's a testimony about a man who, in a single moment, was seen ministering in two different cities, over 1,000 miles apart? A man who left no trail of travel, no time for trains or ships, yet showed up in both places at the exact same hour, with witnesses in each location ready to swear it happened. This isn't science fiction. This is a story tied to the ministry of John G. Lake, the man known as the Apostle of Divine Healing. The event took place during the early years of his healing rooms in Spokane, at a time when the demand for prayer and ministry was overwhelming. Two urgent calls came in. One from a dying man in Iowa, his family desperate and pleading for Lake to come. Another from Spokane itself, a young woman on the brink of death from a sudden and violent illness. Both needed him immediately. Both situations reached their critical moment. At the same time, it should have been impossible. And yet, that day, John G. Lake prayed for both. Not hours apart, not days apart, both at the same hour. Eyewitnesses in Iowa reported him appearing in the sick man's room, laying hands on him and speaking life back into his failing body. In Spokane, at that very same moment, others swore he was still in the healing rooms, his hands over the young woman, praying with the same focus and intensity. By the end of that day, both people were on their feet, both fully recovered, and both testimonies were given publicly, with details that left no room for coincidence. This story will walk you through the unfolding of that impossible day, the phone calls, the desperate faith, the moment heaven bent the laws of time and space, and the aftermath that left even the most skeptical minds searching for answers. If you've ever wondered whether the God of the Bible still works in ways that defy human explanation, stay with me. Because by the time we're done, you might just find yourself typing, "I believe," in the comments, not out of habit, but because something deep inside you knows. This happened. The day began like any other. The morning light in Spokane spilled through the tall windows of the healing rooms, casting long stripes across the wooden floor. It was early, but the benches were already filling. Farmers, laborers, mothers holding sick children. They all came with the same hope, that today would be the day their burden lifted. John G. Lake moved quietly through the room, greeting familiar faces, laying a hand on a shoulder here, offering a brief prayer there. He had learned to pace himself. Some days he prayed for dozens, other days for hundreds. Every face carried a story, and each one deserved his full attention. It was just past mid-morning when his assistant, Robert, hurried toward him with a folded telegram in hand. "It's urgent," Robert said, breathless. Lake took the paper, scanning the short, desperate words. "Man near death. Family begging you to come. Iowa. Please hurry." The name at the bottom was familiar, a friend from years past, now pleading for the life of his brother. Lake exhaled slowly, glancing toward the crowded room. A trip to Iowa by train would take days, and by the sound of the message, the man didn't have days. As he pondered this, the front doors of the healing rooms swung open again. A young boy rushed in, his face flushed from running. "Please, you have to come. My sister, she's dying. Fever won't break. Mama says there's no time." The room fell into a hushed stillness. Two urgent needs, worlds apart in distance, but united by their immediacy. There was no way, humanly speaking, to be in both places. The choice was agonizing. Whom to help first? Whose chance for life to prioritize? Lake closed his eyes briefly, shutting out the noise of the room, the conflicting demands, the logic screaming that he could only choose one. He had learned long ago that moments like this were when he needed to listen for the still, small voice that had guided him since the earliest days of his ministry. When he opened his eyes, there was no hesitation. "Bring me to the girl," he said to the boy. Then to Robert, "Go to my office, shut the door, I will pray for Iowa." It sounded impossible. How could he pray for a man over 1,000 miles away with the same urgency and presence as if he were there? And yet, something in his tone left no room for doubt. In the girl's home, the air was thick with heat and the sour smell of fever. Her mother knelt beside the bed, wringing a damp cloth, tears streaking her cheeks. Lake sat at the bedside, taking the girl's frail hand in his. Her pulse was weak, her breathing shallow, but as he prayed, something shifted. The atmosphere seemed to grow dense, alive, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. At that exact moment, in a modest farmhouse in Iowa, the dying man stirred. His family, gathered in grim silence, saw him open his eyes. Standing at his bedside was John G. Lake. No train had brought him there, no carriage was outside, just his sudden presence, as real as the bed they were sitting on. He laid a hand on the man's chest, prayed with quiet authority, and then he was gone. In Spokane, Lake finished his prayer, the fever already breaking under his hand. The girl's breathing deepened, her cheeks flushed with returning life. He opened his eyes and smiled at the mother. She will recover. Back in Iowa, the man sat up in bed, the color returning to his face. His brother would later swear under oath that Lake had been there in person, that he had seen him as clearly as he saw anyone else in that room. 2 lives saved, 1 hour, and no explanation the world could give. Witnesses on both sides of a miracle. The first whispers began in Spokane before John G. Lake had even left the girl's home. Word spread through the neighborhood like a spark on dry grass. The fever broke. People who had been bracing themselves for the sound of funeral preparations now stood at the gate, craning their necks to see for themselves. The young girl was sitting up in bed, sipping broth, her eyes bright again. Lake didn't linger. He offered a final prayer of thanks, squeezed the mother's hand, and quietly stepped out. There was still the matter of Iowa heavy on his mind, though in his heart he felt the work there was already done. Across the country, in that modest Iowa farmhouse, the atmosphere was just as electric. Minutes earlier, the man's family had been preparing for the worst. They had seen the hollow look in his eyes, the labored way he fought for each breath. And then, without warning, John G. Lake had been there, standing by the bed, as if he had stepped through the door like any neighbor might. The eldest son swore he heard the creak of the floorboards under Lake's boots. The wife said she could feel the heat of his hand as it rested on her husband's chest. Every person in the room agreed on the words they heard. In the name of Jesus Christ, be made whole. Death, release him now. It was the kind of prayer that carried no trace of pleading, only authority. The moment the words left his lips, the man's breathing steadied. The ashen pallor of his skin shifted to a warm tone. Strength returned to his voice. He looked around at his family and said, "I'm hungry." They turned to thank Lake, but he was gone. No footsteps on the porch, no sound of a door. Just an empty space where he had stood seconds before. It wasn't long before stories from both ends began to collide. In Spokane, the boy whose sister had been healed overheard adults talking about the Iowa miracle. In Iowa, relatives visiting from out of state spoke of the Spokane healing. People began connecting the dots and realizing both events had happened at the same hour, on the same day. When Lake returned to the healing rooms later that afternoon, he found a small crowd waiting. Some came with joy in their eyes, others with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Robert, his assistant, pulled him aside. "John, they're saying you were in Iowa today, in a man's house, praying over him." Lake met his gaze without flinching. "And they are correct." Robert blinked, glancing toward the closed doors of the healing rooms. "But you never left Spokane?" Lake simply smiled. "The Spirit of God is not bound by distance. When he sends you, he makes a way." The crowd outside would soon hear the same explanation, though Lake gave it without theatrics. He didn't speak of teleportation or bilocation, as the newspapers might sensationalize. Instead, he spoke of the God who could part seas, stop the sun, and carry his servants wherever the need was greatest. By nightfall, letters were already being drafted. Some wanted the full account from Iowa, others wanted Spokane's witnesses to write down every detail. For weeks afterward, envelopes traveled back and forth, each one affirming the same truth. John G. Lake had been seen in two places at once, and two dying people had walked away whole. And for those who had been present, whether in the farmhouse or the fever-stricken bedroom, there would never be a question about what they had seen. When a whisper became a wave, in the days that followed, what had begun as a whispered marvel in two separate corners of America swelled into a story too compelling to remain local. Letters became the lifeblood of the tale, each penned in the careful script of witnesses determined to preserve the exact sequence of events. From Iowa came a detailed account signed by 6 family members, each one affirming the same facts. The moment of healing, the words spoken, the impossibility of Lake's arrival by natural means. In Spokane, the girl's neighbors and relatives wrote their own testimony, describing the oppressive heat of the sick room, the sudden cooling of her skin, and the return of strength to her fragile frame. And when these letters crossed paths in the mail, something remarkable happened. Communities that had never met found themselves linked by a shared miracle: the spread. By the end of that week, local pastors in both towns were reading the testimonies aloud during services. In Iowa, a Methodist minister described it as a sovereign act of God's omnipresence. In Spokane, a Baptist congregation was moved to tears as the mother of the healed girl recounted her own astonishment. A week later, the story broke into the columns of a small Christian periodical. The headline was modest: "Two healed in same hour by prayer." But the body of the article carried weight. It listed times, locations, and direct quotes from witnesses. The piece was reprinted in other newsletters, and soon the story leapt from the confines of church circles into general interest pages. In coffee shops and barber chairs, in schoolyards and train depots, people debated the meaning of it. Some spoke of bilocation, borrowing the term from ancient stories of saints. Others suggested divine transportation, while skeptics muttered about overactive imaginations and misremembered times. The skeptics. Skepticism was inevitable. A Spokane newspaper sent a reporter to interview Lake. The man arrived armed with a notebook and the kind of polite smirk reserved for improbable claims. "Mr. Lake," he began, "some say you were in Iowa and Spokane at the same time. That's quite a claim. How do you explain it?" Lake's answer was calm. "I don't. I let the witnesses explain what they saw. My role is not to prove the mechanism, only to obey the Spirit of God when He sends me." The reporter pressed for specifics, but Lake refused to turn the sacred into a spectacle. Instead, he spoke about the nature of faith, the willingness to act without seeing the road ahead, and the sufficiency of God's power. When the article was published, it was clear the reporter hadn't been convinced. But even in his skepticism, the piece carried enough of the original testimonies to keep the conversation alive. The believers. For those inclined toward belief, the event became a rallying cry. Prayer meetings swelled in attendance. People began bringing more desperate cases to the healing rooms, convinced that distance no longer mattered. Letters arrived from faraway cities, some from bedridden individuals who wrote simply, "Pray for me. I know God can reach here too." One particular evening stands out in the memories of Spokane's congregation. The girl who had been healed walked into the healing rooms hand in hand with her brother. She was wearing a simple white dress, her hair neatly tied back, her eyes bright. The room fell silent as Lake welcomed her in front of everyone. "She stands here today," he told the crowd, "because God hears the cries of His people, whether they are in this room or 1,000 miles away. In Iowa, the healed man did the same. At a church service packed beyond capacity, he stood and told his story, pausing often as emotion overcame him. "I felt the bed sink when he sat beside me," he said. "I felt the weight of his hand. And when I looked into his eyes, I knew I would live." The ripple effect. The story began to influence not just individuals, but whole communities. In some towns, prayer groups formed specifically to intercede for people in distant places. Emboldened by the thought that God could bridge any gap, testimonies started to come in, not all as dramatic, but each carrying the same heartbeat. "We prayed here, and they were healed there." The idea that God's power could bypass geography began to reshape the way many approached ministry. Ministers who had been tied to their local flocks now felt a bolder sense of mission, writing letters, sending telegrams, and asking for intercession from believers hundreds of miles away. Lake himself rarely referenced the incident in public sermons. He preferred to point to Scripture, to Philip being carried away after baptizing the Ethiopian, to the sudden appearances of Jesus in locked rooms after his resurrection. "The Lord is the same yesterday, today, and forever," he would remind them. His methods are his own. The lasting question. Even years later, when some details blurred in memory, two things remained constant: the timing and the result. Both healings occurred in the same hour. Both lives were restored. And for those who had been there, no amount of reasoning could erase what they had seen. The skeptics eventually moved on to other stories, other headlines. But for the families in Iowa and Spokane, that day was a line in the sand, a before and after that could never be undone. The man who walked in two places. In the weeks that followed, life at the healing rooms returned to its steady rhythm, or at least it appeared to. People still lined up at dawn, still carried loved ones on stretchers through the double doors, still pressed worn photographs into Lake's hands, asking for prayer. But under the surface, something had shifted. For those close to Lake, the change was subtle, but undeniable. He carried himself with the same humility as before, yet there was a deepened intensity in his eyes, as if he had glimpsed something of God's vastness that words could not capture. Those who prayed alongside him noticed it in the pauses, the way he would listen longer before speaking, as if waiting for instructions from a source no one else could hear. Robert, his assistant, tried once to broach the subject. "John," he began cautiously one evening as they locked up the healing rooms, "that day, when you were here and in Iowa, did you feel it? Did you know it was happening?" Lake rested his hand on the worn oak door, thinking. "I knew I was sent. That's all I needed to know. The how belongs to God." He smiled faintly. "If we knew every detail of how he works, we'd stop needing faith." Meanwhile, the girl in Spokane continued to recover, her strength returning in leaps and bounds. Her family became a fixture at the healing rooms, not because they needed more healing, but because they wanted to serve, cleaning floors, preparing tea, offering comfort to new arrivals. The mother would often tell newcomers, "Don't think your distance from here is a barrier. I thought that once. I was wrong." In Iowa, the healed man's farm became a gathering place for prayer meetings. Neighbors who hadn't set foot in church for years came to hear his testimony. Some left with tears on their faces, others with renewed hope for situations they had quietly given up on. He kept a simple wooden chair in his living room, the chair he claimed Lake had sat in during that miraculous moment. "It's not the chair," he would say. "It's the God who met me in it." The private moment. One night, long after the last visitor had left the healing rooms, Lake lingered alone in the sanctuary. The lamplight pooled around him, leaving the corners in shadow. He thought about the two lives, the girl and the man, and the impossible intersection of time and space that had brought healing to both. He remembered the moment in prayer when the air had seemed to shift, when his awareness of the room faded, and he felt, with absolute certainty, that he was where he needed to be, both in the fevered bedroom and the farmhouse. There had been no flash of light, no tearing of the air, just the presence of God so tangible it erased the limitations of flesh and distance. "Lord," he whispered, "if you can send me once, you can send me again. Let me always be where you need me most." The teaching that followed. In the months after, Lake began to weave a new thread into his sermons, not a doctrine about bilocation, but a call to be available to God without reservation. "Most of us," he told one congregation, "limit ourselves before God ever does. We decide what's possible and we live inside that cage, but the Spirit knows no cage. If he needs you in two places, he will see it done." He never turned the incident into a spectacle, never claimed control over it, and never promised it would happen again. But he held it quietly as proof that when the need is great and the vessel is willing, God can bend the very fabric of reality. The legacy. Years later, the story still traveled, sometimes whispered over coffee, sometimes proclaimed from pulpits. In each telling, the details might shift slightly, but the core remained untouched. Two dying people, two distant cities, 1 hour, and a servant of God present in both. For those who had seen it, there was no question. For those who only heard it second-hand, it became a challenge, a dare to believe that the God of Scripture still moved in ways beyond human understanding. And for John G. Lake, it was simply one more page in the ongoing story of obedience. He did not build his ministry on that day, nor did he need to. His foundation had always been the same: listen, obey, and let God handle the impossible. When distance meant nothing, 2 cities, 2 desperate needs, 1 hour, and a man who refused to see distance as an obstacle to God's power. For the families in Spokane and Iowa, that day became a living altar, a moment they could point to for the rest of their lives and say, "Here is where heaven touched earth." For John G. Lake, it was another confirmation that obedience mattered more than understanding. The how was God's domain. His task was simply to be willing. The skeptics came and went. Some tried to untangle the threads of the story, searching for a flaw in timing or memory. But the testimonies stood unshaken, rooted in the eyes and voices of those who had been there. And in the years that followed, the story took on a quiet life of its own. It traveled in the pockets of itinerant preachers, in the letters between churches, in the prayers of believers who dared to ask for miracles that defied reason. It became more than just an account of one extraordinary day. It became an invitation. Because if God could place John G. Lake in 2 places at once, what else might he do? If the laws of space could bend for the sake of 2 lives, what limit could possibly stand in his way when his people cry out? Today you may not be lying in a fevered bed in Spokane or gasping for breath in an Iowa farmhouse, but maybe you are in a different kind of distance, far from hope, far from peace, far from the answer you've been seeking. The same God who bridged 1,000 miles in a single moment can bridge the gap between you and your breakthrough. If this story has stirred something in you, a spark of belief, a flicker of hope, don't let it fade. Share it, speak it, pass it on. Type, "I believe" in the comments as your agreement with the truth that God is still moving, still healing, still doing the impossible. And if you want to hear more true, documented accounts of the miraculous power that flowed through John G. Lake's ministry, follow this channel. We have more stories, each one a reminder that heaven is not as far as you think. Because when God moves, distance means nothing.